minutes. Well, I think we've heard remarkable expression, completely original in its own right, of course, but I hope you, well, if you think I'm wrong, you'll correct me, but which also brings in this debate one of the most powerful traditions within Marxist philosophy, namely a certain kind of critical theory, understood as you said, I mean, in your own words, a self-critical attempt at determining the very conditions in which a theoretical discourse is conditioned or limited, I would say, by its own historical circumstances. So a certain form of radical historicism that certainly owes something crucial to the legacy of the Frankfurt School, especially the first generation, but also probably to other sources. And I don't know if you'd agree with that, but a certain Gramscian reference in that sense might be also useful. I found in particular the fact that at some point you distantiated clearly what you were exposing from a Lukácsian point of view as particularly revealing in this respect, which is not to diminish, of course, the greatness and the importance of Lukács as a philosopher. Now, I would like to try and push you, if I can, a little further on 3 points by asking questions, perhaps expressing concerns again, but basically, I mean, this is because I'm not saying that your presentation was not clear. It was extremely clear. It was also very systematic, and we all perceive that behind that there is a whole body, in fact, of theoretical elaborations. But there are questions which, in my opinion, remain at the edges, if you like. So, first point. I must say I have serious doubts, in fact, about the possibility for any theory to include within itself, even in the most reflective and critical manner, an understanding of its own conditions of possibility. On the one hand, I very well see why this perspective, this demand, so to speak, this need, in a sense, is haunting every possibility of critical theory. The case of Marxism, which is not the only one, is indeed particularly sensitive in this respect, because anybody who has spent years working with Marxism, within Marxism, with concerns that were not only purely theoretical, but also, of course, political, and therefore addressed the conflictual relationship between the use of Marxism and the political use of Marxism and the historical transformations and contradictions, in fact, taking place during the same period, 19th and 20th century, must, I believe, at some point, and this was to a large extent the impulse and the background behind the constitution of the critical theory, must have felt the urgent necessity to lift, I would say, something like a veil or understand, in fact, the tendency that a theory like the Marxist theory, which claims to be which wants to be radically critical, the tendency that it has to become a dogma itself and transform itself, in fact, into a reified or a closed system. Hence, of course, the idea which I believe many currents of critical Marxism in the last decades, or last century, have shared, each on their own way, would somehow become again, in fact, a critical force and an instrument of emancipation, intellectually and materially, if it accepted and if it acquired the possibility to understand, in fact, the social conditions, the ideological conditions, the historical conditions in which it works itself, and to which, as such, it remains subjected. Now, in doing this, a certain Marxism, a certain critical Marxism rejoins, I believe, other currents of critical sociological thought. If you take somebody like Bourdieu, in a sense, this was the program of all his theoretical and academic life, to provide a sociological theory of the conditions within the sociologist himself works and produces, including the language he uses, including the relationships of power within which he or she is taken, perform this critical second move. That Bourdieu could owe something in this respect to Marxism, and perhaps more precisely to a certain vicinity or rivalry, I would say, with the Frankfurt School, is something we can leave aside. Now, this is precisely the point on which I must say I have doubts. Maybe I'm much more of a pessimist than you. I mean, or maybe I'm much more of a Freudian and a Lacanian than you. I don't. I think there are two. If you have the impression that Marxism failed in that attempt at reflecting its own conditions of possibility, and we've seen the political consequences of that in its incapacity, in fact, to provide concrete alternatives and reopen, in a sense, the practical problem perspectives which had been interrupted by history, by the history of real socialism, real existing communism, and so on and so on. We are, in fact, led with the alienating possibility of either dropping Marxism and building some sort of alternative critical theory, or, which is rather my case, thinking that there is something like an absolute limit in this respect, and therefore an element of unpredictability, yeah? And change, in fact, in the history of critical thought, that theory itself will never entirely master. In that sense, maybe I'm even more post-structuralist than you are yourself. So, okay, I've been very long now. There are only two other brief points, if the chair allows me. Huh? Sorry? Yes. Okay. So then these are these are not doubts. These are questions on which today or another time I'd very much like to hear more of you. I start with the second. When you addressed the issue of the fetish form of commodity, I was sure, of course, that this would at some point become central, and it's the case with your presentation. You referred to the dialectic of enlightenment. Was that a reference to the title of Horkheimer and Adorno's Dialectik der Aufklärung? Okay, so that convinces me that the issue might be raised. You said that with social relations of the capitalist type, or generalized commodity exchange type, in fact, something emerges in history, a type of social relation that is entirely heterogeneous or different from anything else that presented itself as social in human history, if I understood you well. And you said kinship. Now, my problem is not with kinship, my problem is with religion. It's with religion. The specter that is haunting, in a sense, Marx's descriptions of fetishism, and used in a very strange way as an element of comparison. Fetishism of commodity is a sort of new religious structure after the disenchantment of the world, after the destruction of traditional religions. To put it in short and brutally, the reason for this heterogeneity, this kind of abstract universality, which returns, in fact, in critical debates continuously. It's again, for example, a very crucial point in so-called post-colonial theory and post-colonial debates. If you read Dipesh Chakrabarty's book, not yet translated into French, he's your colleague at Chicago, isn't he? Yes. Called Provincializing Europe. There's a super chapter in the middle concerning two antithetic meanings or forms of universality, one based on equivalence, which is again a reading of Marx's commodity fetishism, and the other one based on translation, which refers in fact to a communitarian dimension. Now, whether this is economic, is that type of universality economic, or is it theological? I mean, that's the point that on which I have questions and, in fact, no answer. And the final point concerns what you said concerning the intrinsic contradiction of capitalism. I mean, so I would completely agree with your non-reductive reading of that intrinsic contradiction, which, in fact, if I understood you well, rejects simultaneously two types of reductive understandings. One which is hyper-political, reduction to the pure scheme of the class struggle, or class conflict, and one which is juridical, economical, the reduction to the contradiction between private and public forms of property. So that suggests that the intrinsic contradiction Marx is dealing with and trying to elucidate in the development of capital, of Das Kapital, of capital, is something that is at the same time more complex or more comprehensive and lying deeper in some sense than either the pure political or the pure juridical form. But then when you have to express it, you need to I'm not criticizing the simplification of the words, because you need a sharp expression. So you refer to real wealth on one side and value or self-sustained process of valorization on the other side. Well, contemporary critique, also in the wake of a certain critical theory inherited from the Frankfurt School, including the whole analysis of the cultural industry and so on, I believe have made the reference to real wealth more complicated than it might have been the case or looked when Marx described this growing contradiction at the heart of capital itself. That is, the production of real wealth, a continuous increase of real wealth appears less innocent and possibly much more alienating, in fact, than what Marx himself possibly thought and imagined. Now, at the end of your presentation, after you had mentioned Lukács, in fact, and when you reached this very interesting comparison between a certain Marxian tradition and post-structuralism, it seems to me that you, in fact, qualified this seemingly positive reference to the development of real wealth as a result of capitalist history. But I wasn't completely sure, so if you could say one or two more words on that, I'd be particularly interested.
I'm not sure how many minutes I have to respond.
A few minutes.
The problem, thank you very much for very fundamental comments. To do them justice would, I think, eat very deeply into Jacques Bidet's presentation. So I'm going to have to be much briefer than the comments deserve. With regard to the first, the issue of the self-reflexivity of the theory, as far as I'm concerned, we have no choice but to keep on trying to develop an understanding of a self-reflexive theory. What I mean by that is that otherwise we go all the way back to what Marx criticized already when he was quite young, and I think correctly criticized, that one cannot do a social or a cultural analysis of forms of thought as if oneself is not socially and culturally formed. That this comes right back to what he regarded as one of the dilemmas of early materialism, that implicitly it posits itself as the exception to that which it analyzes. Now, I think in the history of attempts to come to grips with self-reflexivity, there have been a lot of attempts that have gone awry, from which I think we can learn, and I see it as an ongoing process. Habermas is another attempt. One of the reasons I don't like Habermas's attempt, or I think that that road leaves something to be desired, is it leaves out of consideration or in the background the dynamic of capital, which I think we no longer can ignore. Maybe in the 70s or early 80s, it was a little possible to ignore it for reasons that I can't elaborate here. I think today we cannot. So one cannot have a self-reflexive theory here based on a theory of the development of language, of linguistic communication, and then have something about capitalism and globalization there, as if these are two different compartments. I agree that critical Marxism does come close to other strains like Bourdieu's, and I think that's a good thing, that there's no reason why the discourse of critical Marxism has to be hermetically sealed off. It seems to me, however, that to the degree to which one faults Bourdieu for not having a notion of historical dynamic, at least for me a convincing one, to that extent one shows that even Bourdieu himself has certain limits that I think a critique of capital can, in dialogue with his approach, try to overcome. As far as fetish is concerned and religion, see, I would argue that religion, like any form of cultural thought, itself is formed historically, and that very frequently the word religion is used to designate something that is unchanging, whereas it always changes. And my good friend Dipesh Chakrabarty, I think his notion of the two kinds of universality, actually one can deal with as two kinds of universality that are generated by capital itself. And if I could elaborate for 30 seconds, even though this isn't a complete elaboration. the idea of use value, or to put it another way, the idea that all objects are objects, is itself a form of universality that comes into being with capitalism. That doesn't mean, however, that it's restricted to capitalism, because it can exist beyond capitalism. But in pre-capitalist society, all objects are not objects. Objects are very different. Different people can handle different objects. A peasant isn't allowed to touch a sword. A man is not allowed to handle a basket. These aren't objects. These are very much imbued with social position. The idea that everything is an object is related to the abstract dimension, but it's not identical to it. So it seems to me that you have two forms of universality that are generated by capitalism, whereas most anti-capitalist thought sees only the one, the abstract. This would be the short way in which I would try to deal with that. I agree, there is a great deal of difficulty in my using the word material wealth. Had I had more time, I would have tried to elaborate why I think that value theory can help explain a runaway form of growth that apparently is generating more and more material wealth, but material wealth itself is not the dominant form of wealth. So I think that if material wealth were the dominant form of wealth, you could have a different form of growth. So I was trying to get away from the idea of either growth or a kind of asceticism, which naturalizes capitalist growth as the only kind possible, and tried to suggest that in a different situation, another kind of growth would be possible. And I wasn't able to do that within this framework, but I think the objection was very well taken for what I presented.
Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Donc la parole est pour le dernier exposé à Jacques Bidet.